What's up, everybody? I'm Jason, and welcome to my live stream for Friday, the 19th of March, 2021. And I have not a tremendously long live stream for today, I don't think. Um, I have a bit of news, I guess you could call it. Adobe has finally released Lightroom Classic 10.2, and it seems in my testing, I've downloaded, installed it, and it seems in my testing that it is that it has fixed the disaster that was 10.1. I'm not getting the issues that I was seeing with my computer not being responsive, and or issues I was seeing after quitting Lightroom, not getting the drives to appear in my computer. It's not sitting or constantly hanging with not responding. So if you are a Lightroom uh, classic user, my recommendation at this point would be to go up and go upgrade to 10.2. It seems that Adobe has fixed whatever they had broke in the 10.1 release. So that's a good thing. Uh, so with that out of the way, let's move on to what I wanted to talk about today, and that is well, it's kind of the evolution of auto ISO and ISO controls, and I kind of want to talk about this as a case study in um, user interface design and the way sort of things evolve and how that can influence what people see as being really important or being important. So I'm looking at this from two perspectives. I'm coming at this from the Canon perspective, and I'm coming at this from the Nikon perspective. There's other, obviously other brands out there. These are the two that I'm most familiar with, and they're the two that went about things in the completely opposite ways, more or less. Uh, Now, I should say before I get into talking about this, that the reason I'm talking about this is I was in the middle of writing my script to talk about the user interface for the EOS R, and I realized that I constantly bring up the way Nikon has handled ISO control, the ISO button and controls on their cameras, as an example, and how long it has took for them to make things better. And I say better, but there's no real judgment on it in the sense like, uh, I think at this point Canon and Nikon have gotten to where both of them are doing things right. And until now, both of them did things wrong, but they did different things wrong for different reasons. And that's what I wanted to explore in this discussion, in talking about this. So, um, where this gets complicated is that when it comes to user interface designs and the way people interact with things, and therefore, in extension of that, the features that people want in their cameras or their products or whatever, and the features that they see that are important, there's a relationship with this. It's not just, well, Nikon did X and it's obvious to all of their users that they should add Y because they did X kind of thing. And so this is one of those places where it's very interesting to see how there's this I think there's this cross interplay between how a physical control is added and how the software sort of workarounds for it are added. So I'm calling, in some respects, I'm calling Auto ISO a software workaround for a less accessible ISO button or ISO control. So I think there's one other thing that's worth sort of talking about briefly before we get into the details here, which is Nikon and Canon, if you look at them historically, have had two very sort of different approaches to the user interface evolution of their cameras. And, you know, some people would say there's a right approach and a wrong approach. I don't really buy that. I think that you just have to look at it and say, look, there's two different approaches and they each have their pros and cons. So Canon has been very willing, and in some cases, I would say even almost too willing to change the user interface of their camera when it looks like they could do something better by making a change. And you have things where they made changes from, for example, the viewfinder information in the 5D Mark III to the 5D Mark IV that almost was a change, felt to me at least like a change for the sake of change. But Canon has been very active, or proactive, well, I won't say proactive, has been very aggressive in changing user interfaces just because there's a better way to do something. Now, of course, the downside, the upside of this is that when they change the user interface and it actually does make things better, it makes things better. And you're not stuck for years and years and years going, boy, you know, if they just did this one little thing, it would make the camera so much easier to use. Come on, what's going on, guys? The flip side to that is it breaks muscle memory. And if you are a professional photographer, for example, who's shooting across multiple generations of cameras, so, you know, or even a very serious amateur, and so, you know, you have a 5D Mark IV and a 5D Mark III and a 5D Mark II, because what you've done is, you know, every time a new camera comes out, you buy a new camera, you make that your primary, your old primary becomes your secondary, your old secondary becomes your backup, or you sell it or whatever. So you have this tailing off of you know, multiple generations of cameras. And what happens when you are, you know, with Canon is because of their willingness to change the user interface, you kind of run into this, like the muscle memory that you had for the, you know, for your primary camera, you got to stop and think about what you're doing on your secondary camera because, well, it's not your primary. It's a, you know, slightly different. Some cases it could be radically different. In most cases it's slightly different, but that slightly could be a big enough difference in user interface or usability or where things are to potentially cause a problem or slow you down or require you to be fluent in multiple camera models. Nikon, on the other hand, has taken the approach that's much more conservative in making changes to the physical UI of the camera, where the buttons are, what the buttons do, etc. And as a result of that, they have been much slower in adapting or adapting the physical interface design of their camera to changes in the overall sort of, the world is moving on and they're not really keeping up. Now, that can be you know, like I said, there's pros and cons. So the con is obviously that things can change in the way we work as photographers, and because Nikon doesn't want to make rapid changes or changes to the physical interfaces of their camera, they in turn you don't get that advancement. And the flip side, of course, is you have muscle memory, and you're very much more likely to, from generation to generation to generation, know where everything is, where all of the physical controls or all the setting buttons are on the camera, because they're the same as where they were in the previous generation. Now, I'm speaking in broad generalities here. Nikon obviously has made changes in places, and they've made significant changes in other places. And the ISO control is one of those things to, you know, where they made changes and made significant changes over time. Well, not so much rapidly, but it's, you get what I'm saying, I hope. So I guess having established that those two sort of design paradigms, as I said, this isn't a one's right and one's wrong. I may be a Canon person, but I can get frustrated that Canon changes things too quickly and, kind of forces me to either, not have a huge diversity of cameras or have to remember everything. Uh, Likewise, if you're an Nikon person, you could easily get frustrated because they aren't changing things and you see obvious places that change should happen. So let's rewind the clock to 2000-ish, the dawn of the digital SLR as a not just a super expensive professional photojournalism tool. So with moving from film to digital, we move to this idea of a ISO setting in the camera, a variation or changing the gain of the sensor so that the camera operates it in, more effectively or operates effectively in different light levels. With film, if you wanted to change this, you'd change the film, and therefore having a pronounced, obvious ISO function control button or whatever on the camera was not a tremendously important function. It's not something, at a minimum you would have to change it, or would be changing it, say, every roll of film if you were doing that. But more than likely, you wouldn't be changing it all that often. And then with DX coding on the film rolls, potentially you wouldn't be setting it all unless you were push processing or pull processing. And that's an entire other kettle of worms that I don't want to get into. So coming into digital photography, if you look at both Canon and Nikon, there's this very early stage. For Canon, it would be earlier than 2002, where the the thought process is like, it's still a film camera. You're not going to change the ISO very often. And for like maybe 2 or 3 years, like basically one generation, Canon didn't actually have a physical UI control for the ISO. You had to go into the menus and change it there. So earlier than 2002, that was the thing. Obviously, that's not desirable if you're shooting a digital camera. So what Canon very quickly, as I said, did is by the first half of 2003, in the introduction of what I would call their first modern mid-range DSLR, the 10D, Canon had moved the control for ISO from being in the menu to being a button on what would be recognizable to most people who shoot Canon cameras now, in front of the top LCD on the top right plate of the camera, behind the shutter release and the command dial. Now, this wasn't ideal because it wasn't actually the button directly behind the command dial. It was the button in the middle of that group of 3 buttons, and therefore it was a little bit harder or it was harder to access. But obviously it was a step. It was very clearly a step in the right direction from having to dig through menus. 3-ish years later, 3.5 years later, by the end of 2006, Canon's rolling out the 40D. So we've had 2 intervening generations of mid-tier cameras. And the 40D moves the button for the ISO to what's the current sort of DSLR Canon 5D high-ish range, area. It's the button directly behind the control dial, the rightmost button on that top plate. Subsequent to that, they make some more changes. So they simplify things for the lower end cameras, the 60D in the second half of 2010. They get rid of the 3 dual function buttons and they replace it with 4 single function buttons. The EOS R makes it available through the touch bar. The R5 makes it available through the rear dial on the camera. But generally speaking, since 2003, at least for the mid-tier cameras from Canon, the um, the controls for ISO has been pretty easily accessible. It's certainly since the end of 2006 on, with the 40D. If you're shooting a mid-tier camera, it's super accessible. You just reach behind the command dial, main command dial on the top of the camera with your shutter finger, and you hit the ISO button, and then you can change the ISO. For Canon's Pro cameras, it was a little bit wonkier. There was a little bit slower progression. So basically, prior to 2007, when the 1D Mark III was introduced, which is roughly generationally, it's the same era as their generation as the 40D. It just, the timing was, it was a little bit later, couple 6 months later, something like that, for it to actually come to market. But prior to the 1D Mark III, you actually had two buttons on the top left plate, so the top plate on the left side of the viewfinder, that you had to push and then use the dial to change the ISO, which obviously that's kind of really annoying if you're trying to change the ISO a lot. And with the 1D Mark III, they went to the design that's still being used on the 1DX of having a ISO button on the top plate, basically in the same general physical position as it is on, say, the 5D Mark IV or the 40D. So a button directly behind the command dial. So broadly speaking, what you can see from this, or what this tells us, is that basically since 2003, and especially since 2006, Canon has had an extremely accessible ISO button. It's very easy when you're shooting in the field, or when you're shooting, to hit the ISO button, make an adjustment to your ISO, and go back to shooting. It does not require you to take your hands off the lens, hands off the grip. You don't have to do anything like that. Now, let's jump over to sort of Nikon's side of things. Now, Nikon, the evolution of their DSLRs is a little bit more complicated. There's some broad things, broad stripes that you can paint, but broadly speaking, they've had several more tiers, it feels like, at least in the mid to high end, that compared to what Canon has in terms of user interfaces, not camera models, but just the way user interfaces were laid out. So in the mid tier, Nikon took forever to, and this is sort of a thing that goes on. So much like Canon, Nikon took their early DSLRs, they took a film SLR that they already had, and they found spots to put controls for digital photographers, or for the digital camera, the screen, etc. They kind of like pulled the film back off, gut the inside, generally, obviously the internals are changing, but the general sort of thing is you can see a real clear heritage from for example, the Nikon F100 into the D100, D200, and that kind of carries all the way to like the D850. There's a real clear heritage there. So for their mid-tier cameras, which I'm calling basically starting at the D70 and going all the way to the D7500, which is the current mid-tier DX DSLR. Prior to the D7500, which was introduced in 2017, the ISO button was found on the back left side of the rear LCD towards the bottom. So you couldn't hit it with your hand on the camera. You had to take a hand off the lens, hit the ISO button, make your adjustments. The D7500 in the first half of 2017 finally moved the ISO button to being behind the shutter release by the command, on the top plate of the camera by the top LCD. Um, Mid-tier cameras made or the high end, the higher end mid-tier, the lower end pro, I don't know what you want to call it. I'm calling the cameras basically the D200 to the D850. There's sort of a, yeah, I know the sensor size changed, but there's sort of a commonality in camera design across all of those. So prior to early 2014 and the introduction of the D810, so the D700, D800, D200, D300, etc. The ISO button was located on the I don't, it was the frame rate or motor drive dial plus combination. There was 3 buttons sort of integrated on the top of it, but it was on the top left plate of the camera. In early 2014, so 2014 through 2017, when Nikon introduced essentially the D810, and this really actually only applies to the D810. They didn't change the interface compared to the previous camera, the D800, but they added a movie record button, and they added the ability to reprogram, or well, movie record. They added the ability, I shouldn't say they added a movie record button. They added the ability to reprogram the movie record button to be your ISO button, essentially. So the movie record button was directly behind the shutter release, right where you could easily hit it with your shutter finger. You hit that, change the ISO with the dials on the camera, off you go. In late 2017, with the introduction of the D850 and the D500, the ISO button is now a dedicated button on the top plate of the camera, right behind the shutter release, very accessible. And the same sort of story goes with the pro cameras. So this is the D1 through D6, essentially. The D4 and earlier, the ISO button was on the back of the camera. It was so on the back of the camera, there was a review LCD, there was a small status LCD, and there was a row of buttons. They were either above or below below the status LCD, and one of those buttons was for your ISO setting. So this applies to the D1, the D2, D3, D3S, and as I said, I think the D4. In 2014, the D4S comes out, and same deal as with the D810. The movie record button, they didn't move the ISO button as it stood, but the movie record button could be reprogrammed to be the ISO button, and it was directly behind the shutter release on the top plate of the camera. And then in 2016, when the D5 came out, or 2017 when the D5 came out, the D5, 2016 when the D5 came out, the D5 has a dedicated ISO button on the top plate of the camera just behind the shutter release. So basically, when both Canon and Nikon took still camera designs and they put digital guts in them. Canon very quickly realized, well, I think, I won't say Nikon didn't realize, because it's very possible that the engineers at Nikon did realize, but they were working with this premise of maintaining backwards compatibility, and once they had muscle memory, however you want to put it, once they had put the ISO button where it wasn't obvious, or it wasn't easy to change it. Now, of course, the other thing that happens with all of this is you get professional photographers, which this is generally the people that are on the review boards or the product advisory boards for, Canon, Nikon, etc. They don't ask random people on the internet or random amateurs as much as they have their, Canon's Explorers of Light, Nikon ambassadors. They go to them, people in the media, to try cameras, and those people are the ones who are making the recommendations. Now, I'm not going to, this isn't to badmouth anybody, because, obviously professional photographers have, even looking at it from different fields, Uh, there's completely different objectives, and there's completely different sort of what's important and what isn't important. For example, just I do YouTube videos. I watch people come out like, Atomos and whatnot, and they have these Ninja Blade, these on-camera recorders. So Blackmagic has one, Atomos has one, etc. Uh, and these on-camera recorders, which I'd love to buy because Canon still has 30-minute, has had 30-minute record limits on their cameras, and they haven't removed them from the EOS R5 yet. Uh, I would love to have them for the ability to just have the camera record indefinitely and not have to worry about it. However, the big selling point of all these things tends to be raw video, ProRes. It's super high quality footage. It's professional production, Hollywood cinema quality, blah, blah, blah. And I'm not saying that that's bad, but for my use case and what I'm doing, the file sizes kill me. And so I completely stopped at buying something like a Ninja 5 or something like that, because there is no H.264 or H.265 recording capability in it. It only the best it does is ProRes LT or DNX HR, whatever LT or whatever the proxy is. And like, I can't get, say, a reasonably high bit rate H.264 or H.265 compression. Now, does that mean the product's bad, wrong, or no? It just means I have a different use case. So the same thing applies when you start talking to professional photographers, reviewing, providing feedback or review of a new camera design. There's first of all, there's a level of inertia. So this is how it's done, this is how it's always been for me, and I don't really want to change. I don't either that it's you don't see the need to change. You don't see the advantage of changing. It's not super clear or super obvious how the changing is an advantage, or just generally, like, and like, I'd hope anybody could appreciate this, but like, if I make my money off of my living, I put food on the table for my family from using my camera, I'm going to be very conservative about that camera, like what I want that camera, how I want that camera to change, because how will that impact my ability to operate as a professional photographer? It's easy to say, well, yeah, but we're talking about, it's a change. And the other sort of side of the equation is that it's also not necessarily entirely obvious that the change needs to happen because of, well, mitigating factors, how often one user does it. I mean, even with the super accessible ISO button on my Canon cameras, I don't change the ISO every 5 exposures. Like, so it's not, if I have to reach a little bit further or something like that, it's not world ending or whatever to have, to jump from, say, X to Y. So, my point here was, you can't always necessarily expect something that seems, and of course, this whole thing seems, and this is where you have your background too. The whole thing about having an easily accessible button seems incredibly obvious to me, because, in part, because I started with Canon cameras, and when I started shooting, my first serious SLR was a 40D, and the 40D had a super easy accessible ISO button. And so that's basically where I started. If I hadn't have started there, I'm not sure, and hadn't had started there and wasn't interested in user interface design, which is something that almost most photographers probably aren't, I probably would not have had the same, like, it wouldn't necessarily be super obvious to me, and it wouldn't necessarily be super obvious to me even if somebody said, hey, this is better, you should, without actually using it. Because, I talk to Nikon people, and because again, I'm interested in user interface design, I talk to Nikon users and on various forums online, and I got song and dance after song and dance about why it wasn't a big deal. Why what I would argue is probably the third most important control on your camera, the third most important control on a digital camera behind shutter speed and aperture, because shutter speed, aperture, and ISO are your exposure triangle. Those are your three handles more than anything else that you deal with. Those are the three handles that the camera, that you use to set your exposure. Why that should be extremely easy to access and extremely efficient, because just from a straight up user interface design, you sit down and you say, look at what is the most important, most used thing on the camera. Obviously that's going to be the shutter release. You touch that every time you take a picture. Okay, what's next? Shutter speed and aperture, or shutter speed and exposure compensation, or aperture and exposure compensation. Pick, but those two handles, shutter speed and aperture. So what did most camera companies do? They have on their professional, their prosumer, their higher end cameras, they have a dedicated dial for shutter speed and a dedicated dial for aperture. Or in Canon's case, well, they have two dials, one for shutter speed, one for aperture, one for shutter speed, one for exposure compensation, or one for aperture and one for exposure compensation. However they get programmed or used. What's the third most important control? Probably ISO. I mean, you could start making some arguments for other things to maybe start creeping in here. Maybe you change the AF mode more often than you change the ISO. Maybe, but from an exposure perspective, ISO, super important. Not necessarily what exposure mode the camera's set to, which is why I've always found that it baffling that Nikon, right behind the shutter button, where something really important like ISO or movie record or whatever, in most of their high-end cameras, has the mode button so that you can change from, say, aperture priority to shutter priority to manual or whatever. And it's like, if you stop and you think, you objectively prioritize what do you change more often on your camera, and therefore what should be easiest to get to when you're using the camera. Do you change the ISO more often, or do you change from shutter priority to aperture priority, or whatever more often? And I don't think anybody's going to objectively say, oh yeah, I change from manual to bulb to aperture priority every few shots, versus I might change my ISO many times a day and never change the exposure mode. Okay, so physical UI, why, and I've had a theory, I should just slight tangent here. I've had a theory on why all of a sudden the record button could be reprogrammed, and why all of a sudden there was a dedicated ISO button on the top of the camera. And it goes back to, if you go and you look at the D4 era. The D4 era was about the point where there was a major exodus of Canon shooters to Nikon. So we're pre-Sony. Sony isn't really pre-Sony is a professional tool. We're no sports photographer is going from Canon to Sony, or at least not in any kind of relevant or significant number in D3S, D4 era. Sony's still kind of not really there. There was a big influx of people moving from Canon to Nikon in the D3, D4 era. A lot of them seem to have moved back to Canon, because this was around the time when the 1DX wasn't really out yet, and it was just coming out. and you had people moving because the 1D Mark IV being a 1.3 crop camera wasn't really nice as having a D3S or a D4, which is full frame, and so on and so forth. And I think what happened is those Canon people that went to Nikon because of professional reasons, because they had to be competitive, and that was where competitive was, basically were saying Nikon, they were coming to the platform from a Canon camera that had an easily accessible ISO button right by the shutter release, and they were basically saying Nikon through NPS or wherever feedback mechanisms, come on guys, what's going on? You're so far behind the curve, fix this. And the lag into that being in the D810 and the D4S is part and partial the lag of feedback moving through the company and engineering changes and whatnot being propagated out to the new generation camera. Remember, it's not like these cameras, Canon, Nikon, it doesn't matter, Sony, whatever. It's not like the camera that's going on the market today started being designed 6 weeks ago. It started being designed a year or two ago or more. And some things just, it takes time to propagate through the process. So let's flip over and talk about auto ISO as an evolution of how things worked. Now, auto ISO to me, we're now at a point where auto ISO is being done right by both Canon and Nikon. What I mean by that is auto ISO should allow you to specify the minimum and maximum ISO range, or the range that it goes over. It shouldn't use a fixed value. It should use whatever is correct based on the metering, based on, like, it should be the third handle of optimization. So if you're in, say, aperture priority, you're telling the camera, shoot at f8. The camera is then looking at the scene and saying, to shoot this at f8, I need a 50th of a second shutter speed. Then it's saying, what is the lowest ISO speed that I can use to get that shutter speed, essentially. So the first handle on auto ISO should be the ISO range, 100 to 12,800, whatever. You should be able to set both ends. In my opinion, you should be able to set both ends. Because you may not want the camera to drop all the way to 100 for whatever reason. Maybe it force because of the way the optimizations work, maybe it allows shutter speeds to drop too low for your liking in general, or whatever. But I can't think of a good reason why you shouldn't be able to set the bottom. So whatever. At least you should be able to set the top. Second, you should be able to tell the camera what your minimum shutter speed is. And I'm very much of the opinion that you should be able to either specify a minimum shutter speed. So, if you're shooting wildlife, you're shooting whales, you're shooting whatever, and you need to have 1,000th of a second shutter speed, gazelles or bears or whales or whatever, you need to have 1,000th of a second shutter speed to freeze action. Regardless of the focal length of your lens or whatever, you should be able to set the camera to that. In addition, you should be able to set the camera to an auto mode where it uses the hand-holding rule of thumb to pick a shutter speed based on the focal length of the lens. And then taking that a step further, you should be able to tell the camera how far in stops, or third stops even maybe, above or below the hand-holding rule of thumb you want the camera to work. So for example, on my 5D or my R5, I usually leave my camera in auto, or have auto ISO set for auto, and then I have it set to a stop faster than what the hand-holding rule of thumb would say. So for a 50mm lens, instead of being a 50th of a second, it's a 100th of a second. Because with 30 and 45 megapixel sensors, what I find is if you use the hand-holding rule of thumb, which I've talked about previously, was a empirically defined, derived rule, as best I can tell, for film, but you're shooting a camera that has essentially 2 to 3 times the resolution of good color film, you can't necessarily, you can't abide by the same rule. So, you know, even for me, even not that I'm saying I'm the greatest or not greatest, but you know, even with image stabilization, now that changes things a little, but even with image stabilization, I find that if I want sharp pictures at higher ice or at in sharp pictures, I have to double essentially the hand holding rule of thumb to get sharp pictures. So, you know, again, 50 millimeter lens, 100th instead of a 50th of a second. So that's what I would argue is the way auto ISO should work. So let's see what happened over time. So again, we're going to start with Canon just because they're first in alphabetical order or whatever. But the first cameras that they really introduced auto ISO in was the 40D. So this is back in 2008. And essentially all that was there were fixed ranges of ISOs that the camera would use. So if you're in program or aperture priority, then it only will go from ISO 400 to 800 or down to 100 if necessary. And it bases this strictly on the hand-holding rule of thumb shutter speed thing. And here again, we're talking about an APS-C camera, and the hand-holding rule of thumb that they're actually using is the hand-holding rule of thumb for full-frame film. So if you had a 50 millimeter lens on the camera, instead of accounting for the narrower angle of view that the sensor sees and the higher pixel pitch, they're giving you a 50th of a second hand-holding rule of thumb. Shutter priority, it was normally just ISO 400, but it would range from 100 to 800 if there was an over or under exposure condition. And then in manual, it was fixed at ISO 400, so it wasn't even really auto ISO then. It was just ISO 400. In 2010, the 60D brought the ability to set the maximum ISO to auto ISO, so you could now tell the camera, well, I want 100 to 800 or 100 to 1600. In 2012, with the 5D Mark III, early 2012, they finally gave you both the ability to set the ISO range and the ability to set a minimum shutter speed of your choosing. So it was either auto, which was given by 1 over the focal length, or 1/250th to 1 second in 1 stop steps. So 1/250th, 1/125th, 1/60th, 30th, etc. to 1 second. And it wasn't until 2016 and the 5D Mark IV that Canon actually had auto ISO that was well designed. So full control over the ISO range, you can set the maximum, etc. The ability to set the minimum shutter speed, so from either manually, so from 1/8000th to 1 second and one stop intervals, or automatically based on the hand-holding rule of thumb with a plus or minus 3 stop adjustment. So you could make it 3 stops faster or 3 stops slower than the hand-holding rule of thumb. So we're going back to talking about, obviously Canon took forever to get, you know, talking about this here, to get auto ISO that was competent. At least until from, you know, if we talk about where things were in the beginning, you know, we're talking about 4 years before, you know, from the 10D roughly till the 40D, before they even, or I think 6 years, yeah, 2002 to 2008, 6 years before they even had auto ISO. And then it took another 6 years before they, or another 4 years till 2012 before they had the you could set your shutter speed minimum for auto ISO, and then another 4 years on top of that before you could set auto to not just be the hand-holding rule of thumb. Now, why do I think this evolved this way, this slowly? I think it comes back to the fact that the ISO button's easily accessible. Auto ISO wasn't a huge if you're a serious photographer and you're not shooting in the hold my hand automatic modes, auto ISO is not so important if you can easily and efficiently and constantly and rapidly change the ISO. And so it becomes it's a evolution moving up. You know, you can kind of see this. It's an evolution moving up from the handheld mode where you aren't setting the ISO, the camera's setting the ISO. And so it's like, well, this, you know, if you look at the 40D, it's very much, well, this is how the hand holding automatic modes work. We're just kind of exposing that in the what Canon calls the basic modes, but you know, aperture priority, shutter priority, program, manual, and bulb. Uh, by the 60D, it's kind of Canon saying, well, you know, maybe people want to set the high end for auto ISO. By the 5D Mark III, it's, well, maybe they want to set the shutter speed, but we're still doing 1 over focal length for auto. And we're not compensating for the fact that it's a 30 mega, or, well, it's still only a 22 megapixel sensor. So at this point, it's not that far off from the the highest resolutions of film to where it maybe needs to have that adjustment in auto. And then with the 5D Mark IV at, now bearing in mind though, this is also applying to APS-C cameras where you have the higher pixel pitch, you have narrower angle of view, so your 50 millimeter lens is the same angle of view as an 80 millimeter lens, and that auto setting isn't really going to be right anymore. But again, there isn't necessarily this huge push, and I never really talked to Canon people, Canon users about this, but at least coming from my own experience, I never really saw auto ISO as being all that important because I could change the ISO very quickly. And, you know, again, as I said earlier about, it's not necessarily obvious that you need to change things if, you know, all the time. And this is one of those things where even though I'm talking about user interface design, I'm talking about capabilities, etc., I never really, like, I never used auto ISO until I got a 5D Mark IV. I just didn't see any value in it, partly because of the limitations of not being able to set the, well, I think I used it on my 5D Mark III, but partly because of the limitations prior to that, I just didn't see any value in using it. And then, like I said, combined with the fact that I can change ISO on the fly without really having to do anything to take my hand off the shooting grip, just rock and roll. Okay, so let's flip the thing over and look at Nikon, what Nikon did. So as I said, Nikon has had historically very poor auto ISO or ISO accessibility to the ISO button. However, by the D200 in 2000, the second half of 2005, they had auto ISO that allowed you to set the maximum ISO speed that the camera would use and the shutter speed between a 30th of a second and slower. I'm not exactly sure what the bottom end is because it's not well documented in the manuals that I've been able to see, but at least a 30th of a second in 1 stop increments. Not great, but compared to what Canon had in 2005 was push the ISO button. No auto ISO capabilities whatsoever in Canon land compared to Nikon land. By the D800 in 2012, basically Canon or Nikon's capabilities were identical to what Canon would come out with 4 years later in 2016 in the 5D Mark II or Mark IV. So you could set the ISO range, maximum, etc. You could set the minimum shutter speed to either auto, which was tunable, or in 1/3 stop increments from, I'm not entirely sure what the upper end and lower end is, but 1/3 stop increments, it looks like, from what I've been able to see, pretty much almost the entire shutter speed range. And that's basically where you ended up with it, you know, with Canon 4 years later. So Nikon beat the pants off of Canon in how they implemented auto ISO. Go back to looking at the camera design. What was there? Why would Nikon need to have a more efficient or a more functional or more capable auto ISO? It comes down simply to the fact that the ISO control is hard to get to. And so it's much more useful as a photographer to be able to put the camera in auto, tune the things you need, maximum, minimum, set a shutter speed that you want the camera to shoot at, and go rock and roll and not have to deal with messing with trying to change the ISO. And so the camera would, you could say 400 to 1600 or whatever, and then go shoot a football game or whatever, and the camera would have a little bit of leeway to tune to keep your exposures good. Now, I can't necessarily explain why nobody was saying, well, come on, guys, why can't we just have an easily accessible ISO button? Except for the fact that, like I said, from Canon's side of things, I never found I never cared that much about auto ISO because it didn't offer me the capabilities to where I would even want to try and use it, because, I couldn't make the adjustments in the tune, and tune it. It was much easier to just use the easily accessible ISO button and not care, versus in Nikon land where you were very quickly, 2005, like not that many years after DSLRs started to really gain sales, you had tunable auto ISOs that really gave you a much better ability to handle and manipulate the camera, or to manipulate what the camera was going to do. And so it was very much easier to put the camera in auto ISO and not have to deal with that ISO button, because you knew it was set up in such a way that you weren't going to go too high on the ISO to get too noisy of a picture, and your shutter speed wasn't going to drop necessarily so far that it was, unusable. And, could Nikon have done better? Well, truthfully, both Canon and Nikon could have been where they are now back at the start. I don't really understand why it wasn't obvious to everybody making things that, look, if we're going to add this functionality, we should allow the user to set minimum and maximum ISO speeds. We should allow the user to tell the camera what the minimum shutter speed should be. Even with the limitations in computational power in a camera in 2005, none of this is so mathematically complicated that the camera couldn't have handled it. So I don't know why it wasn't really kind of there from the start, because most of these settings really seem obvious if you're going to implement auto ISO. I mean, I think part of the reason I never used auto, or didn't really use auto ISO on my 5D Mark III, was, again, it wasn't inherently, like, I could see that, like, I can't set a shutter speed. I can't say, well, what I'm doing, I need a minimum of 1,000th of a second shutter speed. Or from my experience shooting with this camera, the hand-holding rule of thumb doesn't work for me. I need to be faster. Or I'm really good and I don't need it to be as fast. So anyway, that pretty much wraps up what I wanted to talk about with the evolution of auto ISO and ISO controls. And like I said, I'm not going to say that, like, because I don't think it's very, or it's accurate in the slightest to say Canon was right or Nikon was right or whatever. I mean, there's very clearly two different design philosophies behind how Canon and how Nikon evolved their cameras, and consequently, there's different design philosophies, you could say, between how they've prioritized both Nikon, both the companies and the users, how they've prioritized adding features or features in the camera versus what users are demanding or requesting for the camera to add or to do. And so, like I said, you can kind of get away, in some ways, and I don't like, here's my ultimate preference is what we have essentially now. You have a very accessible way to control the ISO manually, and you have a very capable and configurable auto ISO. Because what I found with like the 5D Mark IV and my R5 is there are some situations where I would just like the camera. I don't want to have to think about ISO. I want the camera to just deal with that for me, and I will, I will work with everything else as long as I know that certain minimum parameters are happening. And then there's other situations where I want to have full control. And the auto ISO systems, both Canon and Nikon now, give you both of those. Modern Nikon cameras, easily accessible ISO buttons, good auto ISO, fully functional auto ISO. Canon cameras, easily accessible buttons, fully functioning auto ISO. But yeah, so I know this has probably been a little rambly, a little bit more technical. I know I said I wasn't going to do too many technical things, but I thought this was an interesting to walk through and look at the history and the evolution of these cameras and how these features played out, how the companies adapted them, and potentially how photographers responded or what photographers demanded be added or be addressed with in the camera. Like why it took Nikon so long to move the ISO button versus why it took Canon so long to make a really good auto ISO mode. Based on the other capabilities that surrounded it. So based on, in Nikon's case, having good auto ISO sort of mitigates the problems with the ISO button. Whereas in Canon's case, having an easily accessible ISO button sort of mitigates the problems of not having a super sophisticated auto ISO. So anyway, if you found this interesting or informative or whatever, please smash that like button. If this is kind of content is up your alley, please consider subscribing. As always, if you've made it this far, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.